Hey everybody, this is Jamie Russo. I am the host of the Everything Coworking podcast. I have run coworking spaces for 8 years, and now I spend my time focusing on helping coworking space operators and community managers start and run spaces that attract their best and most profitable members. So I am here today to talk about your team. So the podcast this week is, I can't see my comments. Maybe they'll come up in a second. Sorry about that. So we're going to talk today about your team. So the podcast this week is about hiring your community manager, how to recruit them, where to find them. Hi, Mark. Good. Now I can see the comments. Thank you for the clapping. So where to find them, how to post for them, how to screen when you interview them, and a little bit about the profile of a person that makes a good community manager and how to train your community manager. So I'm going to dive in a little bit in this video on the profile of a community manager. People are always asking, like, what background, makes for a good community manager? Community managers can come from a variety of different backgrounds. So we tend to think hospitality is a good background. Sometimes today, since the industry has evolved a little bit, we can even get folks who have already been community managers. Hi, Melissa from Carlsbad. Awesome. So, but more so here, sorry, let me pull up my slides. I have some slides I'm going to walk you through today. But the way I like to think about, move myself over here. Sorry, you're getting double me right now. The profile is that it's not really about the background. It's about the type of person you're hiring and whether or not they're a good fit for the team. And I'm going to share a tool that I use. One of my coworking startup school students, I mentioned this on the podcast, was saying the other day that he wants to get somebody to help him hire his community manager because he said he falls into this trap of wanting to like and support lots of people. And so he has a hard time saying no to people. He likes everyone and can see the good in all sorts of people, whether they're really a good fit for the role or not. And I have totally fallen into that trap too, especially with sort of younger, newer out of college. I can remember myself at that point, and I want to mentor and support people. And what we really need, though, is the ability to do that, but also to find the people that are really good fits for our team. So just a quick review intro of me. I ran a co-working space under the brand of Enterspace, 2 of them in Chicago and Palo Alto. I was the executive director of the Global Workspace Association for 5 years. And now I spend my time focusing on helping people start co-working spaces and running Community Manager University. So I'm using some slides today because I talked through some of this framework on the podcast, and I kept thinking, this would be much better if it was visual content. So this is my opportunity to kind of get in front of you and help you see visually. So I'm going to repeat a couple of just high-level concepts to set the stage a little bit. So your team is super critical to the success of your business, right? Especially if you're an owner that's not in the space every day. And if you're a community manager and you're watching, you are the heart and soul of the co-working space. And the team can really make or break your business in many ways. Your team really owns sales. Even if you handle sales at a more centralized level, you're probably handling most leads most of the way through your sales process at the location level. So giving tours, sending follow-up emails, that sort of CRM sales process, a lot of that probably happens at the local level with your community manager or someone who's on site. And your team also owns retention, right? So once they get somebody to join the space, they're the person, that really connects the community builds, and wears all the hats that help people be happy in the space, which is not just community building, but, oftentimes making the coffee, making sure the meeting rooms are set, doing all those things that create a great experience for our members. And really today, and I think we're going to start to see this, especially with some of the institutional players getting into the space. And I think this is the opportunity for serviced spaces to compete, is that space is essentially a commodity, right? You're not selling workspace. You're selling the experience and the transformation that your space creates for members. And the word transformation is kind of sounds a bit dramatic, but I truly think that's possible in a really well-run space with a great community manager. Getting people out of their home office where they're not doing their best work, and especially today have like kids and spouses running around making all sorts of noise and distraction. The things that can happen in the space can be truly transformational. Well, I won't preach to the choir too much there. So members sometimes think they come for the space, but they stay for the people or whatever aspect of your community and your culture that is uniquely you, and it's your team that delivers that. So they're super critical. And community generally doesn't happen just by putting people in the same space, right? It's intentional. And again, it's your community manager that tends to bring that intentionality to the community. And your community will grow over time, some organically, but I call it the miracle grow magic of the community manager that makes that happen. So now that I've set the stage a little bit, there's a tool that I like to use, and a business coach of mine uses it. And so that's how I got into it. And my flight group members and my community manager university students have free access to getting their PI indexes done. It's a paid tool. There are other tools like strengths finders and things like that that you can use. So when you're looking at this, the concepts aren't necessarily tied to the tool, but the concept of using a tool. So I like to use a tool to assess teams and develop team member profiles that are a good fit for their role. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through how to think about this. And you can't legally, at least in the state of California, use these types of tools to make hiring decisions in a vacuum, but you can use them as additional information as you're making your decision. So you can have someone take an assessment like this as part of the interview process. And it can be one of those things that helps you, get away from that. I like everyone. I want to support everyone, and can really help you see, is this person really a good fit for the role? Because the community manager role is really unique, right? We ask our community managers to wear a lot of hats, and I tend to break them into community building, operations, sales and marketing, leadership, and finance. And the leadership and finance generally come when your team has been in the role for a little bit of time, but it's a lot of different hats, and it's also a highly extroverted role. So I like the PI index because it covers behavioral factors that tend to apply to the workplace. So not just kind of personal traits, but workplace traits. So they use dominance, extroversion, patience, and formality as those behavioral factors that they look at. And so they basically, for each candidate, will give you an assessment and some nice detail, which I'll show you some examples of a few slides later, about sort of where that person falls on these spectrums. And so dominance is really about the drive to exert one's influence on people and events. One can imagine that most entrepreneurs would be high on the dominance scale, right? Extroversion, the drive for social interaction with other people. And we probably don't have to keep going with this discussion for you to imagine that a community manager with a higher level of extroversion probably does better at the community building and connection piece than not. Patience is the drive for consistency and stability, and then formality, the drive to conform for rules and structure. So these are the kind of scales that they get rated on. And so each person gets a rating on dominance, whether they're low on dominance or high. So people who are low on the dominance factor are creative, harmony-seeking, collaborative. Does this sound like a good community manager? Or high on dominance, independent, competitive, autonomous. Sounds more like maybe the owner, an entrepreneur. Extroversion low would be introspective, matter-of-fact, reflective, pensive. If high on extroversion, outgoing, people-oriented, empathetic, and stimulating. Patience, if low, a little bit high-strung, a little bit impatient, sometimes rushed and intense. We probably don't want that for our community manager, right? High on the patience scale would be steady, patient, calm, and agreeable. So you can see that I like these factors because what they're really doing is helping you see what combination is a good fit for a community manager. And if you are looking at candidates, and well, here, this is probably the better screen. There's no perfect profile, but a community manager more likely falls into being collaborative, cooperative, outgoing, people-oriented, patient, calm, flexible, tolerant of uncertainty. You can think about all the things they need to do in a day. They're customer facing. They're meeting people who are not members who might be there to use a meeting room. So they have to be a little bit extra calm and flexible and professional. They're helping someone figure out the printer who might be a little bit frustrated, or they're collaborating with members and helping them to meet each other. So that kind of grouping, when they rank in those areas on the scales, tends to make for a good profile for this role. And so again, using this tool can help you uncover, because it's really hard in an interview setting, right? To really figure out what type of person you're looking at and how they come across in an interview may just not be, exactly how they play out in real life situations, like running a co-working space. And we can ask sort of those behavioral interview questions to try to get to know them better. But having them take an assessment like this sort of independently, or it's reliable and validated, can help you sort of get to what are they really like. So the other thing that the PI index does is it gives you motivational needs that align with where people fall on those spectrums. So I find this really helpful in terms of managing a community manager. And that's super important too. So I think a lot of us think, okay, we got the manager in place. They generally know what to do. The place is not falling apart. We're getting some new members. Everything's good. I'm a really big advocate of making sure that you're really managing your team on a weekly basis and that you're aligned on dashboards and the goals that you have that you've set together for this space, and that you're touching base on those really frequently. So an example, I talked to someone yesterday who said she was opening a new space, and so she'd done a little shopping in her area. And she said she requested a tour for one of the spaces. She did not get a response for a week and a half. And then she toured the space, and she said the community manager was kind of super low key and didn't collect any additional information from her at all whatsoever, and didn't follow up. And so that person's manager may think they're doing all the right things. They're, giving some tours, they're sitting at the space all day, but really they're not doing all of the right things. And so we want to actively work with our team to make sure that we're aligned on processes, sales processes, follow up, etc. Totally. And so I don't want to go on a huge tangent on this, but this is where you can really differentiate from your competition, because lots of co-working spaces are not being run as businesses and not looking at what are those benchmarks and critical key performance indicators that are important to growing the business and making sure the team's aligned around this. But also, getting your community manager up to speed and making sure that they're happy in their role can also help you get aligned and make sure that they're focused on the right things. So back to what we're talking about here. The PI index gives you some motivational needs for this profile that tends to align with a community manager. So these folks, and again, there is nobody that fits this profile probably exactly, but they may like encouragement, opportunities to interact. Awesome. They have lots of those. Public recognition. So we recognize our members a lot, but what can we do to recognize our team to our members and help them feel noticed for all the great work that they're doing? Visible signs of accomplishment. So this is where those weekly meetings can play out really well. If you're working with them and they're seeing progress against the goals and where the community manager has contributed, then they feel that sense of accomplishment. Long-term affiliation, which we love. We'd hope that our community managers would stay forever. A stable work environment, a supportive team. And this is important if you are running a single location. which I did and had one community manager, it can be hard to give them that sense of fitting in with a team. So how can you make sure you're touching base with them, making yourself available, and giving them that sense of team? And that's one of the reasons I launched the Community Manager University, because I recognize there are lots of community managers floating out there kind of on their own little island, and they need that sense of team and connection. Recognizing them for loyalty, giving them time to gain expertise. So when you're training them, when you're giving them new projects, make sure they're getting the time and support that they need, and really clear expectations. And again, this is where that weekly meeting can come into play. They need to know, what are the priorities? What are the expectations? What are the goals? What are we working towards together? So just a couple of notes on how to act on these insights. So I love this idea. I've done this with my managers. Trade PIs with your team, which can make you a little bit vulnerable. I share an excerpt from my PI here. It's not overly positive in all interpretations. Have a meeting and commit to understanding each other. This can be a great experience to have if you have a broader team also, because we're all really different humans, right? And understanding each other's like whys and sort of where they fall on the spectrum can really help with communication. And I know some of this will feel like kind of squishy, but it's really important. You know, communication is really hard. I have an 8-year-old, almost 9, and I'm always saying to her, yeah, communication is really complicated. Humans are really complicated. You think you say one thing, but people just don't interpret things the same way, right? And our perception of reality comes from, you know, our profiles and how we see the world. So how we might act on some of these things. So the profile of a community manager tends to like encouragement. Can you acknowledge their special efforts? Can you encourage them to try something new? They might need explicit encouragement for that. Encourage their ideas for process and space improvements. They may have them, you know, floating around in their brain, but until you invite them to contribute, they may be hesitant to do that. Give them time to gain expertise, provide adequate training, be patient. Entrepreneurs, I'm one of them. I am a low on that patience scale. So it's helpful for me to see these profiles because it seems obvious when you're looking at them on the slides, but in real life, you know, our personalities probably are different than a community manager's, unless we are one. And so it's helpful to see this and remind ourselves, like, what does this mean for how I interact with my team? Another important thing I see is encourage your team to be able to schedule some uninterrupted time to work on learning new things and doing projects. It's really challenging to give a community manager projects. And right now may be, you know, a little bit of a unique time in that the spaces are quieter and they have time to do this. But when things are busier, they really struggle to have focus time, right? Because they constantly get interrupted. So giving them permission to take time to do some learning, do some training, and work on the special projects that you've agreed on together. Clarity of expectation, providing directions in person, even if that's over Zoom, giving time for questions, giving examples. Again, you know, this may seem like overkill to us, but our team can need these things. It's also important to consider how you, as a manager, how your PI impacts the needs of the employee and the manager. So the PI index gives you this really nice report about what someone might need from a management perspective. So here's an example. To maximize effectiveness, productivity, and job satisfaction, consider providing your team member with the following: opportunities for frequent communication and contact with others. Yes, that fits the community manager role. Well-defined work routines that are consistent and predictable. This can be a little bit challenging in our role. On the other hand, this gives us the opportunity to find, you know, how we want things done, how we want the sales process to be done, how we want member onboarding to be done, and make that clear for our team. And this is comfortable for them. This is just one example, by the way. These reports are very unique based on who the profile is, but this is from a community manager example that I happen to know is a really good fit for the role. Support and encouragement from management peers, flexible environment that takes advantage of their ability to understand others. So I won't keep reading the screen, but you can get a sense of how helpful these reports can be in terms of managing your team. And then This would be an excerpt from mine. Incredibly strong sense of urgency. She's in nearly constant motion, putting pressure on herself and others for immediate results, unable to do routine work. So as a manager, can you sort of be empathetic that this profile, which happens to be mine, might be hard to work for sometimes. And so being self-aware and understanding that our manager has a different profile and what they need, and helping us kind of tweak our approach, and maybe not showing this side too often with our team. And then, just a couple of other, these are again from a manager profile: broadly focused, comfortable delegating details and implementing plans. So if you're like that, definitely be clear with your team, like, hey, I'm going to delegate and I'm going to expect you to run with it, but be sensitive that they may need, clarity. They may need to feel comfortable asking follow-up questions, and you should not be impatient with that. Okay, so I would love to take any questions. I have a few more minutes here. Sorry, I keep looking at my watch because I have a flight group call after this, but I have a couple of treats. There's a download on the Coworking Community Manager job descriptions. It's also, part of the podcast download. I'm going to put it in the comments down here so that you can grab a copy. And then just kind of some final thoughts. I mentioned that I developed a Community Manager University program. And the reason I did that is because community managers require a lot of training. It takes a lot of time when we have turnover. And it's helpful for retention to give our community managers access to a peer group, monthly Q&A, and advanced training, which is what we do in the program. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention you can get more details at everythingcoworking.com/community managers. So I'm just going to pop back to, we'll see if anybody's still hanging in here with me. If anybody has any questions about kind of hiring or the profile, would love to. I'm going to stop sharing. How do I stop sharing? Boop. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Anybody have any questions or anything you want to talk about in terms of community managers and the hiring process? I'm happy to have a chat. Ruben, any recommendations on outside sources to provide additional training to community managers? Ruben, did you miss my last slide? So let me think about other solutions that aren't mine, but I developed a Community Manager University platform to solve that exactly. So there's a boot camp program that gets your community manager started, but there's training for the advancement of your community manager over time. So it starts with a newly minted community manager and goes all the way up to general manager. And so there's kind of a graduated learning path across the competencies that we need a community manager to have. And we do special trainings once a month. This month we're doing actually tomorrow on the sales process, and specifically on the email sequences we send through the sales process. In terms of additional training, the other thing we do training on, which I think is really important, is tour training. So we get into a lot of details around each of the aspects that's part of the community manager role. And I'm trying to add content that I think is really, can help them be better at their role, and that we aren't necessarily good at providing ourselves. We don't have all the expertise across all the domains, right? So let me give some thought around other types of training that's outside of what I provide. If I think of something, I will let you know. Space owners to train to become better managers of their employees. I love that. So I know Kaylin, I see you, and I'm going to answer your questions in a minute too. Ruben, yeah, the PI index is a great resource. I think training on any of those tools like the strengths finders, et cetera, because as I talked about, like, part of the challenge is understanding like who that person is, what their needs are, and then what ours are. And then I would say there's, leadership training. I know some space owners that have brought in, and this is, budget intensive, but have brought in some leadership skills trainers to help them and their team to learn more about leadership, and some of their senior community managers. You know what? I'm going to make a note of that because I think it's a great question and I'm not thinking of lots of good resources off the top of my head, but let me come back to you on that. Make a quick note for my follow-up. I'm going to give that some thought and see what I can come up with and send that to you, or I'll post it in the Everything Coworking Facebook group as well. All right, Melissa, we just opened, so I'm managing director. Yes, you're all the things. Totally. Melissa, you are not alone. Lots of folks. So Kaylin is just opening as well, and I'm sure she feels the same way. She and her husband are opening a space and probably, trying to wear all the hats right now. And this is the challenge about this role, right? Is we ask our community managers to do a lot of things because you're probably doing all these things and thinking, I'd like to get rid of all of them. What if I could hire to do all of these things? So for sure they can do many of these things. And I talked in the podcast, Melissa, I don't know if you're a podcast listener, but in the episode, I mentioned, your community manager, whoever you hire, is probably not going to be able to take every single one of those things off of your plate. 100% in the best way. They're going to have things that they're really good at. So this is the thing about hiring, right? Decide what's most important. Is it sales? Is it community building? Is it marketing? What are the things that you feel like you don't want to outsource? You want the person at the space to be really good at, and hire for those. And then know that you'll need to outsource the other things, like the bookkeeping, for example. So I've always had my manager do a fair amount of accounts receivable, invoice, putting things into QuickBooks, or we've used Intact, whatever system it is. And that has gone well for some and not well for others, depending on that profile and what their strengths are. Same thing with marketing. Some community managers kill it on social media. They just totally get it. And that's one of those things I love to do in-house because it's so much more authentic if you do, but it may take time. And, Ruben, to your question about that, some of those things are the things look, if you want your community manager to run your Facebook ads, they may need a training program on that. So be willing to find those things and hire those. But how soon should you be looking into hiring a community manager? Melissa, I would say you just opened, I suspect that your ramp up is going a little bit slowly. You're in Carlsbad. I'm also in California, and reopening is a little slower here than in some places. So you may just need to be patient. One thing I would do is start documenting all of your processes as you go along so that you can easily ramp up the training of that person. In our Community Manager University, we have lots of tools and templates to make that easier, like opening and closing checklists and member onboarding checklists. But you're going to have some secret sauce things to do the way that you want to do. So as you're doing, if you're closing out the month, for example, do some screen shares. There's a tool called Loom.com. It's free. It's a Google extension. You can take screen shares of your screen. I will do that and then save them to a Google Drive as a training document, give it a good title, and then have the manager kind of go through all those things when they start. So at least you're investing in getting them up to speed. But I would say, when you feel like you have the budget for it, basically the budget's always going to determine it because you might feel like you're ready to get that off of your plate. You could start with someone part-time so that they're kind of taking the heavy lifting off. Or I have no idea what your situation is, but I know lots of owners or, managing directors are struggling with they have kids at home and can't be at the space all the time. And so you may find somebody who can give tours for you and kind of do the heavy lifting at the space. I had one quick tip and then I'll go on to some other questions. I mentioned this on the podcast too, but my most recent setup at my co-working space, because I couldn't find someone exactly for a full-time role, but this turned out to work really well. I had a part-time person, two part-time people. One came in the morning for 2 hours, set the space, made the coffee, set the conference rooms, and managed our male clients. And so that just stuff takes time. But that took that off my plate, off the other manager's plate. And it was, that may be something you do too, is just find the things that are really taking up your time that aren't a real value add for you personally to do and hire that out. And I think especially today, it can be easier to find people that are willing to do part-time roles. Recommendations on where to look for a community manager. Kaylin, so I mentioned this in the podcast too. Kaylin, I don't know if you're a podcast listener, but today's episode goes into some more detail on this. So for a full-time, LinkedIn can be good if you have kind of a good local network. It just depends on, because it's a really local job. Indeed tends to be a really good site that a lot of operators will use to hire their managers. Referrals can be really strong, although I always mention be careful. Oh, and Kaylin, you're one of these about hiring family members. Be careful about hiring family members because you want to be able to get out of that situation if it's not a good fit, right? But Kaylin's one of my co-working startup school students. I have many students who hire family members. And so, good. Yes, Kaylin. Yes. So today it just went live. So I have lots of students who hire family members to be their community manager because sometimes that's, a great fit and it works out really well. But if you end up hiring one full-time, Indeed's a good source. Post to your Facebook page, ask people, but have a job description ready. Know what you're looking for and that profile that we talked about today, because you don't want to get into that situation where you're like, oh, I really like that person. I want that person to work for me, but they're not actually a good fit for the role, right? That's super important. So when you post, make sure you have a link to your job description ready and throw put it in the Google Drive if your website's not ready. No big deal. And then for part-time, Craigslist can work. That's where I found my part-time person. So I would say referrals, Indeed for full-time, and then Craigslist can be a good part-time. And Kaylin, I will send you some info on the Community Manager University training. I thought about that yesterday when we were chatting. Melissa, good. Good. Awesome. Okay, guys, I have to go because I'm late for my call. Thank you for the interaction today. I just super enjoyed it. And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to send me a DM or an email. I love to chat and love to have the interaction. So thank you guys. And I will see you next week, same time.